My husband laughed in open court like this was a networking event and not the end of our marriage. He signed the divorce papers with a smug little flourish, then glanced at me like he expected tears. I gave him nothing, because I'd already done the math. The courtroom was too bright, the kind of fluorescent that makes everyone look slightly guilty. His suit was perfectly tailored, of course, dark, expensive, and chosen to say, "I belong here." Mine was simple, navy blazer, hair pinned back, hands steady in my lap. He leaned toward me while the clerk shuffled documents. "Try not to embarrass yourself," he murmured, smiling like he'd just paid me a compliment. I looked at his wedding ring, still on, still shiny, and thought, you really don't know me at all. Across the aisle sat his mother, Marlene, posture straight as a coat hanger. She wore pearls at 10 in the morning because of course she did. Every time our eyes met, she blinked slowly like she was deleting me. My attorney, Nadia, slid a legal pad toward me. No pep talk, no theatrics, just one sentence written in clean block letters. Let him perform. So I watched him perform. He greeted people he didn't even know. He laughed at a joke from his own lawyer. He kept turning his head to catch my reaction, like I was supposed to be impressed by how comfortable he was ruining my life. I didn't give him the satisfaction. I let him believe the story he'd been telling everyone, that I was the small-town add-on, the cute little ambition, the dependent wife who'd be grateful for whatever scraps his family decided to toss. And if you're wondering why I was calm, it's because calm is what happens when you've already stopped hoping someone will love you correctly. 6 years earlier, I met him in a place that smelled like burnt espresso and new money. I'd moved to Brookhaven, Virginia with 2 suitcases and a scholarship. Brookhaven wasn't big city glamorous, but it loved pretending it was. Brick sidewalks, boutique gyms, people who said summer like it was a verb. I was 24 and working mornings at the campus finance lab while finishing a certification track at night. My jeans were always a little too cheap, my laptop was always a little too old, and I was always tired. He walked into the coffee shop like he owned the lease. Grant Whitmore. That was the name he gave me, like I should recognize it. He wore a watch that probably had a better credit score than me. He asked if the seat across from me was taken, and he didn't wait for my answer before sitting. "You're studying accounting?" he said, glancing at my open notes like they were public property. "Analytics," I corrected, because I didn't like being minimized even then. He grinned. "Ambitious, I like that." I should have heard the undertone. "Ambitious for you." Grant worked in strategy consulting for a firm downtown. Long hours, big clients, endless talk about value. He had a way of asking questions that made you feel like you were being interviewed for a role you didn't know existed. "Where'd you grow up? What do your parents do? What's your 5-year plan?" When I told him I was from a small town in eastern Kentucky, his eyebrows lifted just a fraction. "Wow," he said, like I'd confessed to living in a cabin. "You must be tough." It sounded like praise. It was actually a category. Our first few months felt like a movie where the camera filters out the warning signs. He took me to restaurants I couldn't pronounce and insisted I try everything. He bought me a dress for a gala I didn't know I was attending until the day of. He introduced me to people who didn't ask my name so much as they asked what Grant did. At that gala, Marlene kissed my cheek and said, "You're very pretty, Lena. You'll do just fine." Not welcome, not nice to meet you, just, "You'll do." Grant's compliments always had tiny hooks in them. "You clean up beautifully," he'd say, like my normal face was a problem he'd solved. Or, "Don't worry, I'll handle the tip," when I reached for my card. Or my favorite, "I love that you're not like those other girls who care about labels." I didn't realize until later that he only said that because he wanted me to stop wanting things. When we moved in together, it didn't feel like a decision. It felt like something that naturally happened to women who got chosen. He found the apartment. He negotiated the lease. He picked the furniture. I contributed what I could, and he acted like it was adorable. "Just save your money," he told me, pinching my cheek once like I was 8. "I've got this." At first, I thought that meant partnership. It meant ownership. After we got married, the control tightened in quiet ways that were easy to explain away if you didn't want to see them. Grant insisted we simplify finances. One joint account, one card, everything transparent. He'd phrase it like responsibility, like I'd be immature not to agree. "Trust is everything," he said, sliding a folder across the kitchen counter. And my family is particular about stability. The folder had account forms already filled out, with his handwriting. I hesitated, and he smiled like I was being cute again. Lena, come on, you can still have your little personal spending. I'm not a monster. He set a monthly allowance for me like I was a teenager with a curfew. If I spent too much on groceries, he asked why. If I bought new shoes for work, he raised an eyebrow and said, "Do you really need those?" Meanwhile, he expensed dinners that cost more than my car payment. He liked me best when I stayed grateful. My job was solid. I worked as a junior financial analyst for a regional healthcare network. I loved the work. Patterns, numbers, turning messy data into something clean. But Grant called it support. "You're basically back office," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "But it's cute that you like it." When I got my first promotion, I came home buzzing. I told him I'd be managing a small reporting team. He didn't even look up from his phone. "That's great, babe," he said. "Just don't let it get to your head." That night, he took me to dinner. I thought it was to celebrate. Halfway through the meal, he said, "So I spoke to a partner today. He's hiring an assistant for a high-profile client. I told him you might be good for it." My stomach dropped. "An assistant?" "It's a foot in the door," he said, casual, like he was offering me a breath mint. "And honestly, it'd be good for you to learn how real finance works." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline that never came. "Grant," I said slowly, "I already work in finance." He smiled, patient. "You know what I mean." That's how it went. Every time I tried to grow, he resized me back to something that fit his image, and then he began editing my life the way he edited my closet. He didn't like my friends from work. They complained too much, he'd say. He didn't like me visiting home. "It's a long drive for what?" he'd ask, like my parents were a hobby. He didn't like me going out without him. "Brookhaven's full of weird people," he warned, as if he wasn't one of them. Slowly, my world shrank into the shape of his. I didn't notice at first because I was busy trying to be easy to love. The switch flipped on a Tuesday night in early November, over something stupid, a blender. Mine had finally died. I'd found a decent replacement on sale and ordered it. $49 shipped. I didn't think twice. Grant saw the charge on the joint account before the box even arrived. He held his phone up like evidence. "What is this?" "A blender," I said. "Ours is broken." "We don't need a blender," he replied, voice calm but sharp. "You can't just buy things because you feel like it." "It's $49. He set the phone down slowly like he was dealing with someone unstable. Then he said the sentence that rearranged my entire spine. "You act like you contribute," he said. "But you don't. Not really." I stared at him. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. He kept going because once he started saying the quiet part out loud, it was like he couldn't stop. "My career pays for this life," he said. "My family's name protects us. You're replaceable, Lena. Don't forget that." Replaceable. The word sat in my chest like a stone. That night, I cried in the bathroom with the shower running, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood the rules. He wasn't building a life with me. He was building a life around me, and I was just supposed to stay grateful for the view. The next morning, I did something I'd never done in our marriage. I stopped asking permission in my own head. On my lunch break, I walked into a credit union 2 streets over from my office. Not a bank Grant used, not one his family's friends worked at. A plain place with faded brochures and a woman at the counter who looked like she'd tell you the truth. I opened a separate checking account with my personal email and my work address. No joint access, no alerts going to his phone. I asked for paperless statements and a debit card that wouldn't scream luxury. When the account was active, the woman slid the paperwork toward me. "Anything else?" she asked. I thought about Grant's smirk, his mother's pearls, the way he'd said replaceable like it was a fact of nature. I signed my name and said, "Yes, I'd like to set up direct deposit changes." That evening, while Grant watched sports highlights and pretended I wasn't in the room, I opened my laptop and enrolled in a night course on small business financial strategy. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, just knowledge he'd never bothered to ask if I already had. I didn't tell him. I didn't threaten him. I didn't even look different. But for the first time in years, I felt like I had a door in my life that only I had the key to. And once you find a door like that, you don't go back to living in a room someone else locked from the outside. For a while, my secret life looked painfully small. A new checking account with 3 digits in it. A night course video playing on mute while Grant brushed his teeth. A spreadsheet called Personal, buried inside a folder called Work Stuff, like it was contraband. But small things compound. That's literally the point. I rerouted part of my paycheck into the new account. Never enough for him to notice, always enough for me to feel it. I cut tiny expenses he'd never approve of anyway. The overpriced wine club, the monthly networking dues he forgot to cancel, the fancy grocery delivery that mostly served his ego. Then I did the thing he never expected. I got better, not in a dramatic montage way, in the boring, relentless way that actually changes your life. I learned how to read a small business the way you read a person, where they're bleeding, where they're lying, where they're pretending not to be scared. I studied cash flow, pricing, margins, and forecasting. I watched free webinars. I built templates. I practiced on fake companies until my fingers moved without thinking. Grant noticed the late nights, but he misread them completely. He'd glance at my laptop and say something casual about me, finally taking my career seriously, like he deserved credit for it. Then he'd go back to his phone, satisfied with his own story. The first client came through pure chance, the kind you only recognize when you're ready. At work, a woman named Tessa from vendor relations stopped me in the break room and complained, quietly like it was shameful, about her brother's new restaurant. Not a fancy place, more like a neighborhood bistro trying to survive in a town that loved hype more than consistency. "He thinks he's making money," she said, twisting her badge lanyard, "but he's always short on rent and payroll. I don't get it." I didn't offer advice. I asked questions. How do they price? Do they know their food costs? Are they tracking inventory? What's their busiest hour? What's their slowest day? Tessa stared at me like I'd switched languages. "Can you talk to him?" she asked. That was it. That was the opening. I met her brother Jules in the corner of his own dining room after closing. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work ethic and everything to do with confusion. He slid me a shoebox of receipts like he was confessing a crime. I didn't judge. I organized. 2 nights later, I showed him a simple report, where his money was going, why it wasn't coming back, and exactly what to change first. Not be better. Actual levers. He didn't need a miracle. He needed clarity. He paid me $200 and thanked me like I'd saved his life. I walked to my car with shaking hands, not because of the money, because of what it proved. I could do this. Quietly, repeatedly, on purpose. Within a month, Jules sent me 2 more owners, a boutique gym with chaotic subscriptions and a home cleaning service that was drowning in unpaid invoices. I worked evenings and weekends. I built dashboards. I simplified their billing. I showed them how to set aside taxes so April wouldn't feel like an ambush. I didn't call it a company yet. I called it freelance. That word felt safer, smaller, less likely to be taken from me. Then one of my referrals became my friend. Her name was Priya. She ran the home cleaning service, and she had the kind of intensity that comes from being responsible for too many people's paychecks. She didn't ask me to fix everything. She asked me to tell her the truth, so I did. She listened, took notes, implemented changes, and sent me screenshots of her first month with positive cash flow, like they were baby pictures. After that, she started checking in, not just about work, but about me. She noticed things Grant didn't, like how I always flinched when my phone lit up, like how I described my marriage like a project plan, like how my laugh turned off mid-sentence. One night, after we wrapped a call, she paused and said she knew someone I should meet. "His name's Omar," she told me. "He helps small businesses price properly. He's blunt, but he's kind, and you're undercharging." I almost said no out of habit. Then I remembered. The version of me that asked permission in her own head was gone. Omar became the first person in years who talked to me like I was a professional, not an accessory. He didn't flirt. He didn't flatter. He looked at my service list, my rates, my workload, and my time tracking, and he told me what I didn't want to hear. I was working too hard for too little because I was still trying to prove I deserved to be in the room. So I raised my rates, I stopped taking clients who treated me like a free help desk. I made a clean intake process. I drafted simple contracts. I separated business and personal expenses. I set aside money for taxes like I wasn't playing pretend anymore. I started investing too, but not in the flashy way people brag about online. Mostly boring, diversified stuff. Automatic transfers, a small emergency fund that grew from one unexpected car repair to I could leave if I needed to. That was the real investment. Options. The whole time, Grant stayed convinced I was still dependent. He'd drop little comments about how expensive life was, how lucky I was he handled everything, how his workload supported both of us. He wasn't trying to motivate me. He was trying to keep me grateful. And then the cheating started showing itself in tiny seams, like a bad stitch coming apart. It wasn't lipstick or hotel keys, it was patterns. Grant used to come home and complain about his firm like it was a sport. Suddenly, he stopped talking about work at all. He started guarding his phone the way people guard something fragile. He began going for walks at night, but he never took the dog. And he got weirdly critical of me again, more than usual. If I asked where he'd been, he acted offended. If I didn't ask, he acted irritated. It felt like he wanted a fight but didn't want to look like the one who started it. The confirmation came on a Thursday when I was folding laundry and his laptop chimed from the kitchen counter. Grant had a habit of leaving things unlocked because he trusted the world to treat him gently. An email preview flashed across the screen, just the first line. A name I'd heard before, Elise. She was in his professional circle. I'd met her once at a firm dinner. She'd laughed too hard at his jokes and called him brilliant like she was tipping. The email wasn't explicit. It didn't have to be. It was logistics. It was familiarity. It was the kind of tone people don't use with coworkers when they're being watched. I didn't click anything. I didn't dig right then. I didn't need to. I stood there with a shirt in my hands, feeling something inside me go perfectly still. Later, I checked our shared calendar, the one he insisted on for transparency. He'd started blocking off time with vague labels: client, dinner, travel. But the receipts were hiding in plain sight. A charge on the joint card for a downtown hotel bar on a night he claimed he was at the office. A rideshare receipt that ended in a neighborhood he'd never visited with me. A series of small gifts, nothing scandalous, just enough to say someone is being courted. I screenshotted what I could, saved it to a secure folder, and backed it up to a cloud account he didn't know existed. Then I went to bed next to him and acted normal. That was the part that shocked me most. Not that he cheated, not even that he lied, that I could look at him and feel clarity instead of panic. Because now it wasn't just my gut, it was data, and I knew what to do with data. Priya was the first person I told, not in a dramatic confession, just a quiet sentence over coffee. I think he's having an affair, I said, stirring my drink like my hands didn't matter. Priya didn't gasp. She didn't demand details. She asked the only useful question. Do you want out? Yes, I said, and the word felt like oxygen. Omar gave me a referral for an attorney the way you'd hand someone an umbrella before a storm. Nadia Morales. Calm, sharp, unimpressed by status. When I sat in her office the first time, she didn't ask me why I stayed. She didn't ask me if I'd tried counseling. She asked me what I wanted my life to look like after. Then she asked me what Grant didn't know about me. I almost laughed, almost. So I told her about the separate account, the consulting work, the contracts, the investments, the careful documentation. I expected her to scold me for secrecy. Instead, she nodded like she'd been waiting for that exact sentence. Good, she said simply. We're going to be precise. I didn't file that day. Nadia didn't rush me into a courtroom like a movie. She gave me a plan. Document everything. Keep communications clean. Don't warn him. Don't threaten him. Let him believe his own arrogance until it did the work for us. And it did. Grant sensed a shift in me, less compliant, less eager to be managed, and he hated it. He started picking fights over nothing. He reminded me, casually and often, that his family had resources. He suggested I'd be making a mistake if I tried to leave. When I didn't react, he escalated. He started telling people stories before I'd even spoken. Mutual friends began texting me vague check-ins. His mother's smile at social events got sharper. Someone from his firm unfollowed me on everything like it was a coordinated move. Then one night, Grant walked into the kitchen while I was washing dishes and said, in a voice that tried to sound bored, that he'd been talking to a lawyer about options. Not a conversation between spouses, a warning shot. I dried my hands slowly and looked at him like he was discussing the weather. Inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, because while he was trying to scare me with his last name, Nadia was building a file that didn't care about last names at all, and I was building the one thing he couldn't control: proof. By the time the court date was set, Grant still thought he was playing a game he invented. He didn't realize I'd been quietly studying the rules for months. And I didn't just plan to leave. I planned to walk out with my life intact, plus interest. Court day felt less like an ending and more like a live performance where everyone forgot the audience could see the script. Grant showed up early, laughing with his lawyer like they were about to win an award. He wore a new suit, slightly lighter than the one from last time, like he was trying to look approachable. He even held the door for a couple walking in behind him, just in case anyone was watching. Elise wasn't there. Of course she wasn't. People like her don't sit on hard benches when the story gets messy. Marlene was there, though, seated like a statue in the first row. She had the same pearl necklace, the same tight smile, the same expression that said, "This won't touch us." Grant spotted me and gave me that familiar look, half pity, half amusement, like I'd wandered into the wrong classroom. "You ready to be reasonable today?" he asked, voice low, friendly enough to sound innocent to anyone else. I kept my face neutral. "I'm ready for the truth." He chuckled and shook his head like I was adorable. Nadia didn't react. She simply adjusted her files, calm as a surgeon. When we were called up, Grant took the seat beside his attorney and immediately leaned back like he owned the room. His lawyer, sleek, loud, confident, spoke first, painting me as the dependent spouse with a modest career and limited earning capacity. She mentioned Grant's significant professional demands, his family obligations, his generosity. She said he'd offered a fair settlement and I'd been uncooperative. Grant watched me as she talked, as if he expected the words to pin me to the floor. I looked at the judge instead. The judge was a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and zero patience for theater. She'd seen every flavor of arrogance and wasn't impressed by any of them. Nadia stood when it was her turn. No dramatic opening, no moral lecture. "Your Honor," she said, "we're here because Mr. Whitmore built his case on the assumption that my client is financially dependent. That assumption is inaccurate." Grant's smile flickered. Just a twitch. Nadia continued steady. "We've submitted a complete financial disclosure as required. We've also submitted documentation regarding marital funds and separate property, including accounts Mr. Whitmore failed to disclose." Grant's lawyer's head snapped up. "Objection overruled," the judge said without even looking at her. "Continue." Grant turned toward Nadia for the first time, like she'd spoken a foreign language. Nadia slid a folder toward the clerk, who passed it up. "First, we'd like to address Mr. Whitmore's sworn statement that he holds no accounts outside the primary joint checking and his disclosed retirement plan." Grant's lawyer forced a smile. "That's correct." Nadia nodded once. "Then he won't mind if we discuss the Riverstone account." The courtroom got quieter in the way rooms do when someone says a name that wasn't supposed to exist. Grant blinked. "What account?" It wasn't a question. It was panic hiding behind confusion. Nadia didn't look at him. She looked at the judge. "Riverstone Private Banking opened 18 months ago. Primary owner, Grant Whitmore. Deposits totaling," she glanced down, "well into 6 figures, funded through transfers from consulting bonuses and reimbursements. We have statements, timestamps, and the bank's confirmation letter." Grant's lawyer went stiff. "Your Honor, that account is..." "A separate account?" The judge finished dry. "Like the one he said didn't exist." Grant's lawyer tried to pivot. "It was a personal savings account not relevant to..." Nadia's tone stayed polite. "It is relevant because marital income was used to fund it, and because Mr. Whitmore failed to disclose it under oath." Grant leaned forward, jaw tight. "That's not..." "Mr. Whitmore," the judge cut in. "You'll speak when spoken to." Grant shut his mouth like he'd never been told no in a room before. Nadia moved on without rushing, like she had all day. We also have documentation of marital funds used for non-marital purposes. She held up a page. Charges at the Larkwell Hotel bar on dates Mr. Whitmore claimed he was working late. Rideshare receipts to the same address on multiple occasions. Gift purchases billed to the joint account. Grant's lawyer tried again. Objection, relevance. The judge didn't even blink. Denied. Grant's cheeks went a shade darker. He shot a glance toward the benches, toward his mother, like he wanted her to do something. Marlene didn't move. Her smile had tightened into something sharp enough to cut. Nadia paused, just long enough for Grant to feel the silence. "And now," she said, "we'll address my client's financial profile, which Mr. Whitmore's filings describe as minimal." Grant's mouth curled, like he was relieved to get back to the story he liked. He turned toward the judge, posture straightening, prepared to watch me be reduced. Nadia handed another document to the clerk. The judge looked down, flipped a page, then another, and I watched the moment her expression changed. Not shock exactly, more like recognition, like she'd just found the real spine of the case. "Ms. Hart," the judge said, looking at me directly for the first time. "This financial statement is yours?" "Yes, Your Honor," I said, voice even. Grant's head snapped toward me. The smirk was gone now, replaced by a narrow, suspicious stare. The judge tapped the paper lightly. "This indicates a sole proprietorship with recurring revenue." "Yes." "And a separate investment portfolio." "Yes." Grant let out a short laugh, sharp and disbelieving. "That's not—" The judge raised a hand without looking at him. "Mr. Whitmore." He stopped again, but his eyes were loud. They said, "What did you do?" Like I'd committed a betrayal instead of protecting myself. Nadia kept it simple, exactly like she promised. "My client began a financial consulting practice while employed full-time," she said. "Nothing hidden illegally. Proper reporting. Taxes paid. Contracts documented. She also maintained a separate account for her earnings. We've submitted the business records and a basic valuation based on documented client revenue." Grant's lawyer tried to recover. "Your Honor, even if she has a side business, Mr. Whitmore's income still far exceeds." "Does it?" Nadia asked, still calm. Grant's lawyer blinked. Nadia held up another page. "Mr. Whitmore's filing states his annual income as—" She read the number, then looked up. "However, his bank deposits and bonus statements show a significantly higher figure. And as we've already discussed, he routed funds into an undisclosed private account." Grant's lawyer's confidence wobbled. She turned slightly toward Grant like she wanted him to rescue her. Grant's face was stiff, eyes glassy with the first taste of consequences. Marlene, in the first row, finally moved, just enough to adjust her necklace, as if tightening it could keep their image from falling apart. The judge leaned back, fingers steepled. "So," she said slowly, "Mr. Whitmore underreported income, failed to disclose an account, and used marital funds for non-marital expenses." Grant's lawyer opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "There were misunderstandings in the paperwork." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Under oath." The room felt different now. You could feel it, like the air had shifted away from Grant and toward the facts. Grant turned his head toward me, voice low, urgent, stripped of charm. "Lena, what is this? Since when do you have—" Nadia stepped in smoothly. "Mr. Whitmore, do not speak to my client." He stared at her like she'd slapped him. I kept my hands folded in my lap, nails pressing lightly into my skin, a reminder to stay steady. Inside, I was shaking, not from fear, from relief, because the thing I'd carried alone for years, being treated like I didn't count, was finally being weighed by someone who didn't care about his last name. The judge looked at my statement again, then at Grant's filings, then back at Nadia. "Given the discrepancies," she said, "we're going to address discovery violations and adjust the temporary support request accordingly. I'm also ordering a forensic review of the undisclosed account and any related transfers." Grant's lawyer's face tightened. "Your Honor." "No," the judge said, firm. "Mr. Whitmore's credibility is compromised." That sentence landed like a gavel inside his chest. Grant's mouth opened slightly, like he couldn't compute that word being applied to him. Compromised, not misunderstood, not misrepresented. Compromised. He looked around as if someone would correct the judge. No one did. When the judge continued, technical language about disclosures and asset division, Grant stopped trying to look relaxed. He started looking hunted. His knee bounced once under the table. He pressed his lips together. His eyes darted, calculating exits like the room had turned on him. And in a way, it had. Because the room was finally seeing what I'd seen at home. The insecurity behind the confidence, the control behind the charm, the fragile ego that needed me smaller to feel big. As the hearing wrapped, the judge gave us a final, pointed look. "Ms. Hart," she said, "I appreciate the thoroughness of your disclosure." "Thank you, Your Honor," I said. Grant flinched at my voice, not because it was loud, because it was steady. We gathered our things. Grant's lawyer leaned in close to him, whispering fast. Grant didn't answer. He stared straight ahead like if he didn't look at me, I couldn't be real. As we stepped into the hallway, he finally turned. His voice was low, tight. "You lied to me." I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so perfectly him. In his world, my privacy was betrayal. His secrecy was strategy. "I protected myself," I said, and kept walking. Marlene brushed past me without a word, eyes fixed forward, like if she acknowledged me, she'd have to acknowledge she was wrong about me. Grant stood there, shoulders stiff, watching his story fall apart. Outside, the winter air hit my face like clean water. Priya was waiting near the steps, hands in her coat pockets, expression sharp with concern. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked, "Did it go the way it needed to?" I exhaled, slow. "Yes." Nadia stepped beside me. "He's going to be loud," she said. "He's going to posture, but he can't unring this bell." I nodded. My throat felt tight, not with sadness, something closer to release. I walked down the courthouse steps without looking back. Not because I was above it, because I finally understood something simple. The version of me he married, the grateful, adjustable, eager to please girl, was never the real me. She was just who I had to be to survive him. And now that I didn't need him to survive, I didn't need his approval, his money, or his name to matter. He spent 6 years telling me I was replaceable. Turns out I was only replaceable in his life. In mine, I was the upgrade.